Radical Candor, Chapter 1. Build radically candid relationships. Let us begin at the very beginning, which is always a good place to start, and which in this case is a question that turns out to be more complicated than it first appears. What is the job of a boss? Most people, if you ask them this question, will reach for something about strategy, or performance, or hitting targets, or making decisions. And those things are all real parts of the job. But Kim Scott's answer is more fundamental than any of them. The job of a boss, she says, is not to do the work. It is to create the conditions in which other people can do their best work. And the primary mechanism for creating those conditions is not process design or headcount planning. It is the quality of your relationships with the people who work for you. This sounds almost disarmingly simple, and in a way it is simple. The complication is that most of the professional training people receive before they become managers points in a different direction. It teaches you to be expert, analytical, decisive, and efficient. It does not particularly teach you to care, deeply and genuinely, about the individual human beings sitting at the desks around you. In fact, a common piece of received wisdom about management, one that has been circulating in organizations for well over a century, actively discourages personal connection. Be professional. Do not get too close to your reports. Do not blur the line between the personal and the professional. Kim Scott thinks this advice is not just wrong but actively harmful. Not wrong in a soft, feelings-focused way. Wrong in a results-focused, empirically observable way. Teams led by managers who genuinely care about the people on them and who are willing to tell those people uncomfortable truths consistently outperform teams led by managers who do not. That is the core argument of this entire book. And Chapter 1 is where she explains the mechanism. The mechanism is what she calls the two dimensions of radical candor. The first dimension is care personally. This means treating the people on your team as full human beings with lives and aspirations and fears and histories that extend well beyond whatever project they are currently working on. It means being interested in those lives, not in a performative or intrusive way, but in the way that a person who genuinely gives a damn about another person is interested. It means, to use her phrase directly, giving a damn. The second dimension is challenge directly. This means being willing to tell people what you actually think, about their work, about their ideas, about a plan that has a serious flaw in it, about a presentation that was not as good as it could have been. Being willing to say the true thing even when the true thing is uncomfortable to say and uncomfortable to hear. Now here is the crucial part of the framework, and the reason it is genuinely novel rather than just a repackaging of be nice and be honest. The two dimensions are not a trade-off. They are not a sliding scale where more of one means less of the other. They are independent axes, and the magic happens specifically in the combination. Challenge without care is not radical candor. It is something Kim Scott calls obnoxious aggression. You have probably worked for someone who practiced this, possibly without even knowing the name for it. The person who gives very direct, sometimes very accurate, feedback in a way that makes it feel like a personal attack rather than a professional observation. The person who is right about what is wrong but who communicates it in a way that leaves the other person feeling diminished rather than helped. Obnoxious aggression can produce results in the short term. It is also corrosive to relationships, to trust, and ultimately to the quality of information that flows toward the person using it, because people stop telling the truth to people who hurt them for telling it. Care without challenge is not radical candor either. Kim Scott gives this failure mode its own name too, ruinous empathy. This is probably the most common failure mode among managers who think of themselves as good people. Ruinous empathy is what happens when you care so much about not hurting someone's feelings in the short term that you fail to give them the honest feedback they need to improve. The manager who watches an employee struggle with a repeated problem and chooses warmth over truth, again and again, until the performance review arrives and the employee is blindsided by a verdict they have never seen coming. And then there is the fourth quadrant, the one that does not even have the partial excuse of good intentions. Kim Scott calls it manipulative insincerity, neither caring nor challenging. Feedback that exists primarily to manage the giver's own social position rather than to help the receiver. Empty praise given because it is easier than honesty. Silence about a problem because surfacing it would be politically awkward. This is the territory of the office politician, and it is more common than most people would like to admit. Kim Scott has a memorable example she uses to illustrate all four quadrants at once, and I want to use it because it is genuinely clarifying. Imagine you are in a meeting and you notice that a colleague has their fly undone. What do? Radical candor. You quietly pull the person aside and mention it, with a small human note that you have been there and it is not a big deal. You cared enough to notice and cared enough to say something, and you said it in a way that preserved the person's dignity. Obnoxious aggression. You announce it loudly in front of the group, perhaps framing it as a joke, and watch the person's face fall. You told the truth. You just weaponized it. Ruinous empathy. You say nothing because you do not want to make the person feel awkward. The person walks around for the rest of the day in a state you could have remedied in 30 seconds. Your silence was not kind. It was comfortable for you. Manipulative insincerity. You stay silent, but not because you are genuinely worried about the person's feelings. You just do not particularly want to be the one who said anything. Same situation. Four completely different responses. Three of them feel in the moment safer or easier than the radically candid one. All three of them are, in their different ways, a failure. Now let's take this framework out into the world a little, because the pattern it describes is very old indeed. The Roman senator Cicero, who was one of the most skilled orators and political operators of the first century before the Common Era, wrote extensively in his letters and philosophical works about a concept he called amicitia, friendship, which in his usage carried a much stronger professional and political meaning than the word carries today. For Cicero, true friendship between men of public standing was defined precisely by the willingness to tell each other difficult truths. He wrote with characteristic bluntness that the friend who flatters you is not a friend but a flatterer, and that flattery is poison to friendship the way rot is poison to wood. The visible surface looks fine for a while. The structure underneath is compromised. Cicero's own career is an interesting test of how well he actually practiced what he preached. At times, he did exhibit a kind of radical candor in his public speeches that got him into serious trouble with very dangerous people. His Philippics, the speeches attacking Mark Antony's seizure of power after Julius Caesar's assassination, were so direct and so damaging that Antony eventually had Cicero killed, and specifically ordered that Cicero's hands be cut off and displayed, alongside his head, because those hands had written the words and those words had been the problem. That is an extreme consequence for speaking truth to power, and I mention it not to suggest that you should fear for your hands the next time you give someone a direct performance review, but because it shows how long and how consistently human beings have understood that honest speech carries risks, and have had to decide whether those risks were worth taking. In a modern professional context, the stakes are considerably lower, but the psychological resistance is surprisingly similar. Speaking the uncomfortable truth to a person who has some power over your situation, or to a person whose feelings you care about, or simply to a person you have to continue working with the next morning, requires something most management frameworks barely acknowledge at all. It requires a kind of courage that is not dramatic or heroic. It is quiet daily and repeatedly exercised in small low-stakes moments, so that it is available when the higher-stakes moment arrives. Kim Scott's concept of bringing your whole self to work is related to this. She is not asking you to do therapy with your colleagues or to turn every team meeting into a vulnerability circle. She is making a narrower and more precise point. When you show up to work as a complete human being rather than a carefully curated professional persona, you give the people around you permission to do the same. And when people are allowed to be whole rather than performed, they are more likely to say what they actually think, which is the whole point. There is a quote she uses early in the book that I want to end this opening section with because it sets up everything that follows. She says, You were also born with a capacity to connect, to care personally. Somehow the training you got to be professional made you repress that. Well, stop repressing your innate ability to care personally. Give a damn. That is not a soft prescription. Stop repressing something you were born with is actually quite a demanding instruction, because most professional cultures spend years layering the repression on, and it does not peel off easily. But the argument of this whole book is that the effort is worth it. In the next part, we look at what happens when you build that caring foundation, and why it is the thing, above all other things, that makes the challenge possible. Part 2. Why care has to come first. There is a sequence to the two dimensions of radical candor, and getting the sequence wrong is one of the most common ways the whole project fails. You cannot begin with challenge and arrive at care. You can try, but what you will produce is not radical candor. You will produce a boss who says very honest things to people who have no reason to believe those honest things come from genuine concern, rather than from indifference, impatience, or the pressure of a deadline. And people who have no reason to believe the criticism comes from care will not process it as feedback. They will process it as a threat, and they will respond defensively, and the defensive response will tell you nothing useful, and the cycle will repeat until someone leaves. The care has to come first because trust takes longer to build than a conversation and dissolves faster than it accumulated. You cannot make a withdrawal from a bank account you have not yet opened. Think about the most useful piece of critical feedback you have personally ever received. The feedback that actually changed something, that you still think about, that improved the way you do something. Almost certainly that feedback came from someone you trusted. A teacher who had spent months demonstrating that they genuinely believed in your ability. A mentor who had shown, through small repeated actions, that they were rooting for you. A friend who had been there through enough of your real life that their assessment of your blind spot carried weight. The content of the feedback mattered. The relationship that carried the content made it possible to hear. Kim Scott is explicit about this. Relationships may not scale, but culture does. One person cannot care deeply about 50 or 500 people simultaneously in the way that they can care about 5. The relationships themselves remain small and individual, but those individual relationships, multiplied across an entire organization where the expectation of genuine care and genuine honesty is the norm, produce something larger, a culture, an atmosphere. The kind of organization that people want to belong to and where they feel safe enough to bring their best thinking rather than their most defensible thinking. Let me take you to a particularly interesting historical example of what happens when an institution tries to build the challenge before it builds the care, and does it at enormous scale. In the years following the Second World War, American management thinking became, for a brief period, the most influential set of ideas about how to organize large groups of people in human history. The reason was partly the success of American industry in the war effort, and partly the extraordinary appetite for practical guidance in rebuilding Europe and Japan. Figures like Peter Drucker, whose ideas about management by objectives were enormously influential throughout the 1950s and 60s, articulated systems for measuring performance, setting targets, and holding people accountable to them with a rigor and sophistication that was genuinely new. The problem, which took several decades to become fully visible, was that the accountability structures were much better developed than the relationship structures. You could measure an employee's output against their objectives with impressive precision. You could hold them accountable through formal review processes that were clearly documented and legally defensible. What the systems were much worse at was creating the conditions under which a person would genuinely tell their manager about a problem before it became a crisis, or admit uncertainty about whether a target was realistic before committing to it, or push back on a direction they privately thought was wrong. Because those behaviors require a relationship, not a system. And systems are much easier to design and deploy at scale than relationships. This is not an argument against systems. Kim Scott is quite pro-structure in the practical chapters of this book, but it is an argument for getting the sequence right. Build the relationship. Establish the care. Then the challenge, the direct honest assessment of what is working and what is not, lands as information rather than threat. There is a daily example of this that I find very instructive. Two doctors deliver the same diagnosis to two different patients. The diagnosis is serious. The news is bad. One doctor has been treating this patient for 3 years, knows their family, has sat with them through previous difficult periods, and is known by this patient as someone who has always told the truth while also clearly caring about the outcome. The other doctor is delivering the diagnosis at the first appointment. Same words, radically different conversation. Not because the second doctor is less skilled or less honest, but because the care has not yet been demonstrated. The patient receiving the diagnosis from a relative stranger will spend a portion of their mental and emotional energy assessing whether this person can be trusted, whether they are missing something, whether a second opinion is warranted, rather than processing what they are actually being told and figuring out what to do about it. The care is what allows the challenge to get through. In Part 3, we look at what direct challenge actually looks like in practice, and specifically at the most common reason people avoid it. Part 3, Challenge Directly, and Why We Keep Not Doing It. Kim Scott makes a distinction that I want to spend some time on, because it clears up a confusion that causes a lot of people to misidentify their own failure mode. Challenging directly does not mean being harsh. It does not mean being blunt in the sense of blunt as a weapon, designed to leave a mark. It does not mean saying everything you think at full volume without filtering for context, timing, or the other person's ability to receive it. All of those things are obnoxious aggression, wearing the costume of honesty. Challenging directly means being willing to tell the truth about what you observed, what you think, and what you believe needs to change, in a way that is specific enough to be useful and timely enough to still be actionable. That is a much narrower and more precise thing than being blunt. A person can be extraordinarily direct while still being kind, humble, and careful about how they frame what they are saying. The reason most people avoid challenging directly, even when they know they should, is not cruelty. It is the opposite. It is that they care about the other person's feelings and they want to protect them, which is an excellent instinct being deployed at the wrong time horizon. Protecting someone's feelings in this moment, by not saying the true thing, almost always costs them more in the longer run than the discomfort the honest conversation would have caused. Here is a practical example that most people who have worked in any organization will recognize immediately. Someone gives a presentation. The presentation has a real structural problem. Maybe the argument is circular, or the data does not actually support the conclusion it is being asked to support, or the recommendation conflicts with a constraint that everyone in the room except the presenter seems to have noticed. The meeting ends. Nobody says anything. The presenter leaves with a clear conscience and a fundamentally flawed piece of work that is going to cause problems later, and everyone who stayed quiet in the room did so because they cared. They did not want to embarrass the person. They did not want to seem like the difficult one. They told themselves the problem was not that serious, or that someone else would surely raise it, or that maybe they were wrong about the flaw. And so the caring, broadly distributed across the room, produced a collectively unkind outcome for the person who needed to hear something honest. This failure mode has a name in social psychology: pluralistic ignorance. It describes situations where a group of individuals each privately doubt a shared position but assume, incorrectly, that everyone else privately agrees with it. Each person looks around the room, sees no dissent, and concludes that their own reservations must be wrong. The silence produces more silence. The private doubt stays private. And the group marches confidently toward a conclusion that none of its members would have endorsed individually, if asked honestly. Pluralistic ignorance has contributed to some genuinely significant historical disasters. Sociologists have studied it in the context of financial bubbles, where individual investors privately suspect a market is overvalued but look around at everyone else buying and assume their own doubt must be wrong. They studied it extensively in the context of the Challenger disaster, which we touched on in earlier chapters, where engineers privately doubted the safety of the launch but read the room as confident and kept their doubts private. The common element in every case is that the room's apparent consensus is not built from genuine individual agreement. It is built from everyone's estimate of everyone else's opinion, which is itself built on the same false signal, and the whole structure is held up by nothing except the mutual fiction that everyone else is fine with this. The person who challenges directly in that meeting, the one who raises the hand and says, "I think there is a structural problem in this argument and here is what I am seeing," is doing something that feels, in the moment, like being difficult. In retrospect, they are usually the person who saved the room several weeks of work, and the presenter a much harder later conversation. Kim Scott tells a story about her own experience with this, early in her career at Google, that is worth pausing on because of how much is packed into it. She gave a presentation to senior leadership, including Sheryl Sandberg, that apparently went well. Sandberg pulled her aside afterward and offered what by all accounts was warm and genuine praise for her thinking and her ability to see multiple sides of a complex question. And then she said, very directly, "You said a lot in that presentation. Was you aware of that?" And suggested she might want to work with a speech coach. That single exchange has been repeated in essentially every summary of this book ever written, because it so perfectly captures both dimensions at once. Sandberg had established, through the warmth of the praise that preceded it, that this was coming from a place of genuine investment in Kim's success, and the specific, immediate, private, not personalized observation about the was direct enough to be immediately actionable. Kim went and worked with a speech coach. The problem was addressed. The relationship between the two of them was not damaged by the honesty. If anything, it was deepened by it. In Part 4, we look at the boss's third responsibility. Not just guidance but team composition, and specifically at the management of people at different performance levels, which is where the theory of radical candor meets one of the most practically difficult situations any manager faces. Part 4. Low performers, high performers, and the conversations nobody wants to have. Kim Scott is direct about something that many management books treat delicately or not at all. Being a radically candid boss sometimes means having conversations about performance that will be very difficult to have and will not always end in the way you would like. Not every person can be developed into the role they are currently in. Not every performance problem can be solved with better feedback. And pretending otherwise, out of kindness or avoidance, is itself a failure of radical candor. She describes a spectrum of performance situations and the responses they call for. At one end, you have someone who is new to a role and struggling but clearly capable and clearly trying. The radically candid response here is coaching. Specific, frequent, immediate feedback that gives them the clearest possible signal about what to do differently and why. The mistake most managers make with a struggling new employee is giving vague, reassuring feedback that does not actually help them understand what needs to change, out of a desire to protect their confidence. But confidence built on incomplete information is not confidence. It is fragility waiting for the real assessment to arrive. Somewhere in the middle is the much harder case. Someone who is competent, sometimes quite good, but who has a specific behavioral pattern that is causing real problems for the team. Maybe they are brilliant individually and terrible in collaboration. Maybe they deliver excellent work but communicate in ways that create chaos around them. Maybe they are technically strong but chronically miss commitments. These situations require radically candid conversations that are specific about the problem, honest about the stakes, and clear about what needs to change and by when. These are not conversations that feel good to have. They are conversations that feel necessary and sometimes, when they go well, produce significant and lasting improvement. At the far end, you have the situation where someone is genuinely not right for the role, has been given clear feedback and real opportunity to address it, and has not done so. Kim Scott's position here is unambiguous. Keeping someone in a role where they cannot succeed in the name of kindness is not kind. It is a slow, prolonged version of the bad news, experienced by everyone around them, including the person themselves, rather than a single difficult conversation that allows everyone, including the person, to move to a better situation. She is not cavalier about this. She acknowledges the weight and difficulty of the decision. But she is clear that radical candor, extended to its logical conclusion, sometimes means making decisions that cause short-term pain in service of longer-term well-being for everyone involved. The historical pattern she is pointing at here has an interesting large-scale version in the management of the Apollo program in the United States, the project to put human beings on the moon before the end of the 1960s. What made the Apollo program remarkable, among many things, was the clarity and speed of its communication of bad news upward. Gene Kranz, the flight director who became famous partly through the Apollo 13 crisis, built a culture in mission control where the expectation was explicit. If you see a problem, you call it. Immediately. To anyone. You do not hold it. You do not wait to be sure. You do not protect your superior's peace of mind by managing the information before it reaches them. You call it because the cost of the problem getting bigger is always higher than the cost of the alarm. That culture was not an accident. It was a deliberate response to the Apollo 1 fire in January of 1967, in which 3 astronauts died during a ground test because of a combination of technical failures and a culture of communication that had allowed concerns to be minimized or delayed on their way up. The investigation afterward produced not just engineering changes, but explicit cultural changes. The right to call a problem at any level of the organization, without social or professional penalty, became a design principle of the program. The result, by most engineering and management analyses of the Apollo program's successes, was a communication culture that could process bad information fast enough to respond to it, which in a system as complex and dangerous as spacecraft is the difference between mission success and catastrophe. The scale is different. The stakes are different. The underlying principle is the same. Radical candor about problems, including performance problems, delivered with genuine care for the people involved, produces better outcomes than the comfortable fiction that everything is probably fine. In the final part of this chapter, we look at what Chapter 1 is really building toward. The argument that these individual radically candid relationships are the seed of something larger than themselves. Part 5. Relationships that scale into culture. Kim Scott ends Chapter 1 with an observation that sets up the entire rest of the book. She says that relationships between a boss and their direct reports are the building blocks from which a culture is made. A single radically candid relationship is a valuable thing in itself. Hundreds of them, sustained over time across an entire organization, are a culture. And culture is the thing that determines what happens when nobody is watching. Consider what changes in an organization where the norm is radical candor rather than ruinous empathy or manipulative insincerity. Problems get surfaced earlier. Bad ideas get challenged before they become expensive commitments. Good work gets specifically recognized rather than vaguely praised, which means people understand what is valued and can produce more of it. People who are struggling know it, from honest, timely feedback, rather than discovering it for the first time in an annual review. People who are excelling feel genuinely seen rather than generically appreciated. And the person at the top of the team receives a much more accurate picture of what is actually happening, because the culture has taught people that bringing bad news is safe and expected rather than career limiting. That last point is not a small thing. The accuracy of information that reaches the decision maker at the top of an organization is one of the most important variables in that organization's ability to navigate a rapidly changing environment. Organizations where the culture filters, softens, and delays bad news on its way upward operate on systematically distorted information, and they make systematically worse decisions as a result, sometimes for years before the distortion becomes visible enough to explain the bad outcomes. The researcher Amy Edmondson, whose work on psychological safety we will discuss in more depth in the chapters ahead, found in study after study that the teams which surfaced problems fastest were not the teams that had the fewest problems. They were the teams where it was safe to talk about problems. That is a crucial distinction. The team where nobody ever reports a problem is not a team without problems. It is a team with problems that are invisible to the person who could address them, which is a much worse situation, masquerading as a better one. Here is the everyday version of that in an office setting. The manager who holds the most comfortable weekly meeting, where the mood is always positive and the news is always good, and everyone goes home feeling pleasant, may or may not be running the highest performing team. The manager who holds the most honest weekly meeting, where good news and bad news are reported with equal comfort, where disagreement happens in the room rather than in the hallway afterward, and where the boss can be visibly told something they did not want to hear without the temperature dropping by 10 degrees, is running the team with the best chance of catching and correcting problems before they become large enough to cost more than they would have cost in that meeting. Now I want to name one complexity before we close this chapter, because Kim Scott herself addresses it, and it would be dishonest to omit it. Radical candor is not culturally neutral. What counts as direct but caring feedback varies across cultural contexts, and the specific verbal and nonverbal forms that signal care in one context can signal something quite different in another. A degree of directness that feels refreshingly honest in one cultural setting can feel disrespectful or even aggressive in another. This does not mean that radical candor is culturally relative, in the sense of being optional in some places and mandatory in others. The combination of genuine care and genuine honesty is universally valuable. The form through which that combination is expressed has to be adapted, thoughtfully and respectfully, to the person in front of you and the context you are both in. The book's title contains a word that is worth sitting with one more time before we move into Chapter 2. Radical. In its dictionary sense, radical means going to the root of something, striking at the source rather than the surface. Radical candor is not extreme candor, in the sense of saying everything you think at maximum volume at all times. It is candor that goes to the root of the boss-employee relationship and asks what that relationship actually needs to be, at its foundation, in order for both the boss and the employee to bring their best to the work. The answer is trust, and trust is built from two things that are available to any person regardless of their title, their organization size, or the culture they happen to be operating in: giving a damn, genuinely, and being willing to say the true thing. That is Chapter 1. Chapter 2 goes deeper into the specific practice of guidance, the honest back and forth of praise and criticism that is, in Kim Scott's phrase, the atomic building block of being a good boss.